Thank you for joining us this morning for our grazing corn residue workshop here. We're gonna go ahead and get stuff started right away with Jennifer Harrington. She is a staff attorney with the Center of Ag Law and Taxation at Iowa State. And she's gonna give us an attorney's perspective on some lease considerations and building those, just so we can start grazing and end grazing with a happy landlord and happy tenants. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, thanks, Beth. Yeah, I guess I would hope that that's what people take away from this, or at least take away a few pointers. And thank you for having me here first thing in the morning. So thanks everybody for tuning in. And with that, let's get started. I'm an attorney, so of course I have to start all my talks with a disclaimer. And this disclaimer says that I'm an attorney, but I am not your attorney. This means that I'm giving you kind of the legal framework or things that I would, highly advise you think about. But ultimately, I can't write your lease for you. That's something that either you need to decide to contact your own local attorney for, or kind of power through keeping that in mind. Also, I kind of talk about things that I saw when I was in private practice and also that I see here at the center. That's not necessarily what ISU always has maybe necessarily in its ag decision maker or other things of that nature, but we'll kind of go over maybe some provisions you'd like to take from there or think about that come from the ag decision maker and other tools that extension has. This is my contact information. You can find me pretty easily on ISU's website, extension Jennifer Attorney Harrington. It's pretty easy to find me, so it's not that bad as long as you're in a search engine. If not, I'm sure your local extension office can help you find me if necessary. So we're going to start kind of at the basics, but a basic I think is a good refresher when you think about this. Sometimes asking a landlord or going out and pursuing somebody to graze corn can seem like an overwhelming ask, or where do we even begin? And I think kind of remembering kind of the building bricks of what we're trying to get to can kind of help us figure out how we want to approach that situation. And so ultimately, a lease is a contract. And I say that because there's a whole body of contract law that kind of applies to a lease when it comes to that. But that also means that, in some ways people can walk away, breach, and really only suffer financial consequences. You don't get to put your neighbor in jail for breaking a contract. That's not how that works here in America. And so luckily, what you're doing is just kind of entering into this contract that says, I'm going to allow I'm going to pay you money, and in return, you're going to allow cattle on ground. So oral contracts are valid. So I have to say that, like, they are valid. They can be enforced, but they are hard to enforce in courts. And that's because a portion of the time in court will be spent trying to figure out what the contract actually was, which was what was the meeting of the minds, what was the intention of the parties at the time that they entered into this contract. And so as you might imagine, your attorney's fees go up. The time before the court, the stress of preparing for trial to just even establish what the basic contract was really increases the risk to you as a producer or you as a landlord if you don't have a written contract. But so that is why we will always recommend that you at least put something down in writing, because that is kind of best practices. However, there are additional considerations when we think about what we want when it comes to a lease, because a lease is right in general is where a landowner, right, is selling the right of possession to another individual. So in general, unless otherwise specified in the written document, landowner cannot go onto the land during the lease unless the lease allows or the tenant gives permission, right? And so if they go onto land without the tenant's permission, they risk a trespassing claim. And you might say, like, oh my God, does that actually ever happen? And to that, I always say this court case from the Iowa Court of Appeals in 2015, where basically, and it actually dealt with corn stover. funny enough. But basically, the landlord came in and kind of plowed under the corn stover. We'll go over some other provisions of Iowa law, but the court found them guilty of trespass, the landlord, because the possession was actually in the tenant's name, right, during the term of the lease. So what you're doing is you're getting the right to occupy the land. However, there are special provisions for farm leases, and I think a lot of you are probably very familiar with this, right? So that we have farmland lease provisions in the Iowa Code. It's in Chapter 562, right? And it's a leasehold of feeding livestock on the land, including by grazing. So at least there's an argument to be made, and I think most likely would be successful, that leases for grazing corn stover or kind of corn remnant, or even just corn straight up if that's what's going on. Whatever you guys like, the cool science stuff that you are learning after the the legal stuff in the morning, ultimately that probably is an agricultural lease. And so there's special provisions that come along with this, right? Because of that, the tenant, so if anybody was actually was a tenant on the ground and raising crop on that ground, they have the right to the full plant. Okay. And so the landlord can't say at that point, so you have to understand kind of the legalities of the situation and what your landlord can rent to you. And also, if you are dealing with somebody who maybe is cash renting the tillables, you might want to make sure that they have the right to kind of sublet you to go on that ground and kind of do that. It's always, again, kind of better to get advance permission than to fight about it in court. But that's just kind of from a cost benefit analysis. But under Iowa code, right, anybody who grows the plant pretty much has the right to the full plant. And then also that is the presumption, right? Unless otherwise agreed to in writing. And I say that because that part is very, very important when it comes to a written lease, because most written leases change this default, right? So the leases you find on Ag Decision Maker, a lot of the other templates that I saw from other state extensions, which again, you would want to revise to make sure are operable to your state, kind of change that default and have, say, after harvest, like if there's any remnant, right, of the corn stalk, then I'm allowed to keep it as the landlord. So again, like written leases can kind of change what the situation is. And that very much depends on who you need to be working with when it comes to getting a grazing lease going. But also, because a grazing lease is also an agricultural lease, there is another protection that's here. And that is because there needs to be a termination notice sent if you don't want an auto renew into the next year, right? So if you have a year one cattle grazing contract, November, December, right? Termination date is in December. That's all fine and dandy. That's great. You get off the ground in December, you pay per day, or you know, however you price terms. And again, something we'll get to a little bit later. But once you do that, you will likely receive a termination notice prior to that occupation, even saying, hey, we're not going to renew it. I want you to come back to the table before next year. And so you'll probably receive that notice. If you don't receive that notice, then the same contract is valid. Now, again, you can always kind of re-enter negotiations, and maybe that's the bargaining power you want to get a change you wanted, right? Like if you don't make this change, then we're under the old contract, which may or may not be as favorable, right? There are additional resources kind of on agricultural leases, right? So grazing lease is a subset of that big umbrella, which is the agricultural lease. There's some on our website, which is cult.iastate.edu. And so there's a big multi-page, legal review that kind of goes over how farm leases are treated in Iowa law and kind of the parameters of what is legal. You can't enter into kind of like an indefinite contract. It can't go on for 50 years. Like there are some interesting state law provisions. And then also tax implications of a farm lease. We just don't really have the time to go over it today to have it make any sense to you. But when you're talking to landlords, it's good to kind of know what and what is and is not, a deductible or a depreciable expense for the landlord, and how this income might be treated on your landlord's tax return, but then also on your tax return, right? These expenses, these are how they're going to be treated on your tax return. Most likely pretty straightforward from the cattleman's point of view. But for your landlord, it might be a little trickier of a situation, or they might want a different lease because of where their financial situation is. And then there are lease forms, but these again kind of deal more typically with a traditional tillables kind of operation. There's not so much a grazing lease form that's available through ISU. There's a few dated ones through other extensions. But ultimately, like I said, a lease is a contract. So you want to put together the pieces that make sense, that basically memorialize the agreement you've come to with the other party, right? If you're the cattleman with the landowner, if you're the landowner with the cattleman. So a few pointers when we keep this in mind, right? Communication between the landowner and the producer tenant, right? Like that is first and foremost going to be the most important part of the lease. And I say this because the only time contracts get looked at are the day they are signed and then when people are upset. And that's just an unfortunate reality of kind of how that works. And so a lot of the times lawyers work on contracts knowing that somebody briefly skims it, signs it, and it almost never gets looked at again, right? And that's just the unfortunate reality. But if there is a breakdown in the relationship, or if there is kind of any question about, how expenses were going to be allocated, or fence repair, right? Having a written document that kind of says, well, these were our duties and responsibilities, I think makes people negotiate or reach a compromise than continue to argue about like who's right about whose initial responsibility it was. And so a contract can kind of resolve conflicts before they become deeper, more ingrained, and then you really truly lose that contract going forward. And as we all know, we just live in communities where we want to have reputations where we're easy to work with and we're accommodating where possible. So with that in mind, we have to remember that a lot of farmland is under rental. One way or the other, either they're doing it kind of just how ownership really is here in Iowa. It's 58% of farmland overall is rented. Now, again, this comes from kind of a row crop operation point of view perspective. But 53% of these people, right, among the rented, so among the like approximately 60% of land that is rented, so among that, make that the new 100, 53% of them don't have any farming experience. And then either 47 have only like a little bit or are retired, right? So they might not be keeping up with current practices, right? Like they might not understand why we are returning back to putting cattle on stubble, right, onto corn stover. And so you might have to do a little bit of education on what the costs and benefits are. There are plenty of price calculators out there. And again, I'm sure you guys will go over them more in detail today, but there are a few on this, we can go over that as well. But there is an education component that might be necessary when you are entering in negotiations with these people. And then also, because of that, just make sure that you are able to communicate with your landlord in a way that they can understand. And sometimes that is just like monthly newsletters or end of season updates, right? Like maybe quarterly is what you can handle. But that kind of communication can be really key in just getting good terms and kind of and exploring what your farming future means to you, right? And communicating that to your landlord has them buying into that as well, right? Like they want to feel like they're part of the progress. So on that, when we kind of come to like what should you know before you enter into the table, or before you really kind of sit down, after you've maybe tested the waters, you see that they might be open to this practice, okay? You need to know your costs, your overhead, and your break-even points. And I think probably today you will go through the various tools that are out there to figure that out. And there are some amazing tools out there, but that's something you need to understand before you even kind of go into really truly discussing these contracts, these leases. But share that information, right? Like you don't have to overwhelm them with graphs, right? Like that can be very overwhelming, but you can say, hey, okay, like it does not make financial sense for me to do this if we're going to talk about rent at $20 an acre, or whatever that point is, right? Where at what point do you need to say, like, no, having this lease is not worth that. I'm not saving money. Anticipate the landowner concerns, right? What are the concerns? Putting cattle on any place that doesn't routinely have cattle probably has them a little bit concerned from a liability perspective. And we'll kind of talk about certain things you can do to kind of address that situation. And then share your farming goals and plans, right? Like, again, they want to buy into the bigger picture. You don't need to give them the nitty gritty. But you do want to say, like, hey, this is a family operation, or even if it's not, right? This is what we envision as our growth pattern, or this is how we envision being sustainable, or what is the value added that you are giving to yourself, and the reason why you are getting up every morning and choosing a pretty hard profession, right? So share that reason, because it really has your landlord wanting to root you on. So landowners, right? Like I'm not quite sure who's in the audience. I know it was definitely, hopefully it's a mix of both. But also it doesn't hurt to know the other side if we are mostly producers. But if we are some landowners here in the webinar today, I will say, you want to maybe share your goals for farmland, right? Like why, what do you envision as the 10-year plan for your land? And what do you want to see? Like what values are you picking when you are looking towards the land? And if you're the farmer of the land, right? Like what methods are you using? That can be good, right? Like that's a point of sharing and kind of seeing how we can work together to address things when bumps arise in the future. Learn about the production needs, right? And challenges faced, right? You need to know what's going on in the cattle market. You need to know kind of what the situation is, so that at what point are you becoming a cost saving method, or because if you're not, very few are going to take on that additional liability risk from a producer standpoint and pay more money just to have them corn fed. Maybe some, but again, part of this might be trying to encourage the practice. And then know your costs and what you need, right? If you need some source of revenue in order to pay the tax bill, make sure that's there, right? Or if you do need to get an additional rider on your insurance policy, that might be something you need to talk to your insurance agent about and see what the cost is for that. So there are things to keep in mind when doing this. So what are we going to negotiate, right? So that was kind of my pitch to, what is actually going to go on here? How do we approach just the initial part of it? How do we get ourselves in the right framework? And now these are the things we need to talk about, right? And the first and the foremost is price. And again, I'm assuming you guys will get inundated with other better ways to calculate it. There are plenty of resources out there and methods to choose to do this. But again, what we've typically seen when I've seen these written leases is rent per head per month per day, or like per time period. And that really relies on the producer, on the cattleman, to have good numbers, right? And have good record keeping. If we're really going to do by head and say like an animal gets sick and then gets taken off, like are we, there's a level of trust there. Or you can do carrying capacity per acre, right? And so it's just like, well, the most you could put onto this ground would be 80. So I'm going to charge you for all 80. And if you end up only doing 60, you only do 60, or, and part of it can be, again, you can kind of write whatever pricing terms you need to, but just something to think about. Once you kind of have that method for determining what the price is going to be, then you need to think about payment dates. And I would specify payment methods. Like if you wanted a check to a certain entity, make sure you put that in there. If you want it Venmo'd, you can do that, right? Like you can do a lot of things. They're pretty cool. But if you have a preference, put it in the contract. And then payment address, if something is going to get mailed, right, to a PO box or to an address, just make it pretty clear, like who's supposed to get what when it comes to notice. And then also verification, right? So if you are going to do per, per animal per day, how, let's just make sure that people feel comfortable verifying maybe information and record keeping, right? So you want to just make sure that there's records to kind of verify the total amount given or owed. ISU does actually do surveys for corn stalk grazing, right? So we do kind of know what the average price is in general areas. But again, these are survey results, and appropriate rents do probably, we'll go over this, but kind of rely on like other amenities for the cattle that might be available compared to other places where, the labor costs are really going to catch up to you. And so because of that, either the rent needs to be a little bit lower, or we just don't have information. People aren't doing that. And so again, things really depend on the parcel itself. In a lot of ways, these are averages. And as we all know, averages, one extreme one way or the other can really kind of like swing where that average number gets to. So when it comes to the lease, the things that I would like to say, conditions that are important to how the rental price was set should be acknowledged somewhere in the lease. And there probably should be somewhere in the lease where it says the maximum number of animal units, or however you want to define it. And again, like if you know the age of the cattle that are going to be there, and they're certainly going to do that, and they're not going to be mixed age, maybe. But I would have, animal units and do it from that way, and have the max number, and that would be X amount of the various ages and their corresponding animal units. Just a recommendation, you ultimately again can write whatever you want, because a contract is kind of the agreement of what you've decided. But I think animal units is probably a very straightforward way. But then also other conditions, right? So water, fencing, weather preparedness, right? If this is going to be done in November and December, what happens if there is a big snowstorm, or whatever other fun things, right? Or if it does continue on, if there's an early spring, that's probably not. Anyway, just think about that, right? Who's going to be providing the water, if there is like a well there, and that's going to be the use, and then all of a sudden that goes out of commission, is that a reason to terminate the contract, or is it just going to be lower rent because we have a backup plan and we can make it work, right? Just things to think about, and I think kind of acknowledge that like the rental price was set because of these conditions. If they fail to be here, we either come back to the table, or I have the right to walk away. Another thing that's often overlooked, but that I think unfortunately cause more disagreements or kind of just grumpiness than should be there sometimes, are vehicles, right? So one, where our access point's going to be, and you can identify them on a map if you want to. Sometimes that's just the easiest way to do it. Get the county GIS map and like mark where they can go in and out with the cattle truck. But then also, people feel certain ways about ATVs and OTVs, UTVs, and where they cannot be driven. And so if you have any expectations one way or the other, or if that is equipment that you routinely use, then you might want to disclose that, right? Just so that everybody is aware of it from the beginning. Because it's an easy thing that's easy to overlook, but that sometimes kind of deteriorates the relationship faster when it probably wouldn't have, right? Otherwise. And then also what I like to call about is termination circumstances. Again, these don't have to be in-depth, long conversations with people. But I think sometimes we just need to acknowledge like, hey, if somebody dies one way or the other, right? Like, is that reasons for us to just walk away from this contract? Either party, natural disaster, right? Like if something just really happens, there's no stover there, right? Like we live in places of weird weather. Am I going to be able to cancel it, right? Or harvest was really, really late, right? And then there's a lot of snow predicted. Like, where is that trigger point, and when is that trigger point? And then we also kind of have just breach. So usually we say, if you're not following the terms of the lease, which usually for, the cattleman is not paying rent on time. But there are other things, right? Like it can be not gating correctly. There are provisions for what we call breachy animals. So animals that have managed to escape more than 3 times aren't allowed on the grounds, right? Things of that nature. Sometimes we see those provisions. And that kind of goes into these liabilities, right? So what would happen if we have a cattle escape event? What if there is an injury to a third party? Most Iowans, I would like to think, know that these are animals that they should not be harassing by any means, but even kind of interfering with, I guess, for lack of a better term, for a lot of people. But that's not necessarily true. There was a really great Iowa Supreme Court case. It really dealt with a cow on Interstate I-80 and the liability associated with that. And it kind of said, long story short, Iowans don't know that a cow would stay inside a gate unless it was unlocked or like left unlocked. That's something that you would just kind of have to get an expert to testify about when it comes to proving negligence. And that was kind of a little segue into saying that, like, it's a very interesting liability field for cattle currently. And then also kind of cattle disease or property damage, right? Like, unfortunately, like livestock do cause damages intentionally, definitely not intentionally. But because of that, like there are damage costs associated with it. So what is the responsibility for payment or notification of these things, right? Like I've noticed something I want you to fix. How are you going to communicate that, right? So who pays for the cost to remedy? So that's kind of when you have these situations, those things probably talked about like, well, then somebody would have to do this, and so ultimately relieves to somebody's going to have to pay. And so that's what we call liability, right? If you have liability, right, you get a car accident happens because a cow is out on I-80, right? Who is paying for the damages to the truck, the driver, and to the cow, right? Like the cow was injured. So like who has to pay for that, right? So liability is what is the term that we kind of have for that in the legal world. And then what we also have is what we call indemnification. And that's where that says, I'm going to be responsible for my own actions alone. And even though I might have rights and responsibilities that arise from being a landlord or being the owner of the cattle, I'm going to be relieved of these responsibilities because you're agreeing to be responsible for your own actions. And so indemnification usually kind of, again, kind of says in a very long way, right? I promise I'm not going to, if an accident happens and damages arise, I promise I'm not going to bring you into this lawsuit against me, right? Saying that like you had a duty of care to make sure that the fences were installed correctly as the landowner, or if that kind of thing. So sometimes it gets really legalese, like this really, really long paragraph that I know you all are really enjoying reading right now. But sometimes it can just be as simple as a sentence, right? They're not responsible for the debts or liabilities incurred or damages caused by the other party, right? And that should be enough to get yourself dismissed out of the lawsuit. So not everything needs to be crazy wordy. Sometimes it does, but it really just depends on the situation. I would also recommend, right, insurance requirements. I would put it on both. And then I also think you would have to decide if you want to see proof that they actually purchased an umbrella policy in a certain amount or X amount for any kind of cattle damage that might occur. And then the other thing to think about is that if somebody terminates the contract early, right, or something of that nature, is there a liquidated damages provision, right? Is somebody owed money because there was a breach of the contract, right? And because of that, we're just going to agree that damage amount, like for an early termination, right? If you kicked me off the land and I was counting on my cattle to be fed there, and you kick me off and you don't let me know until a week before, like at that point, right, that's a breach of the agreement. And so because of that, I have a right to damages. What is the damage amount? Now we can either argue, okay, well, what was the actual cost to feed them, right? Like all that fun stuff we're going to get into and how you got price determined in the fun part, you would argue in court for how much damages you're owed. Or you can agree in the contract, okay, you early terminating costs me an additional $4,000. You owe me $4,000 if you terminate within a month of when I'm supposed to put my cattle out there. Right. And then you're not arguing about like, well, what was the true cost to you for that early termination when you could go get hay out on the open market. Right. So it's just something to think about. Again, by no means are any of these things mandatory, except for probably price and location. But these are things that probably are worth at least kind of acknowledging and just making sure people have a plan for. And I would always say memorializing in the contract because it will save you on the back end if an issue does arise. So you've negotiated, you've come to an agreement, you figured out some of the terms. So what needs to be in the lease, right? And I like to say you need to state the obvious, right? Names, addresses, phone numbers, address and the legal description of the parcel, right? And you should be able to get that from land records, which are free access to the public here in Iowa. And then time frame, right? Start date, last date, like what are we actually looking for? Payment terms, right? And then with that, consequences for delay, right? That might be something to think about. Okay. And then you want to add in the big important terms, right? Responsibilities and duties regarding fencing. In general, it is ultimately everybody has a duty to not act negligently. That's what it is here in America, you know. And so if you own livestock, you have a duty to not be negligent in your behavior with your cattle. And usually that includes making sure that they are fenced in. But we do not have a fence-in statute. And so maybe that's something to think about. Also, same kind of goes for partition fencing. And so if you are interested in fence law at all when it comes to Iowa, we do have a webinar that is recorded, but also just the materials and the slides. And I think even just an outline or like a whole overview about Iowa fence law available at the center's website, right? cult.iastate.edu. That goes over kind of rights and responsibilities. Ultimately, that would be the landowner who would make that decision if they want to invoke kind of partition fence processes. But again, there's no affirmative duty to build a fence in between property. Basically, one landowner will want to build the fence and then they can make the other owner contribute is kind of how that goes. But when we get to grazing leasing, right, if there are fences and that is part of what is negotiated in the price, because the fences are so good and we know that they can actually retain cattle within them, we're not going to have to bring portable electric fencing. Because of that, you know, obviously probably rent prices are higher. And so at that point, you know, you'd want that spelled out in the lease that the landlord is responsible for fence repair and maintenance. If tenant sees, you know, a fence issue, it is up to them to notify the landlord within X amount of hours, right? And things of that nature, landlord agrees to fix it within 1 week or whatever, right? Just spell that out very clearly. Same goes for water, right? And what the access to water is going to be and whose responsibility that is. Cattle care, and that includes maybe something that might happen in a heavy snow ice event, depending on where people are. Supplemental feeding, again, typically usually the cattlemen, but if you're going to change that, then you need to acknowledge that. And then also if there are buildings on the property at all, or again, that was something that was negotiated within, make that very explicit, right? Like there will definitely be some kind of structure that I can park my cattle, or I'm allowed to utilize the parking space for my cattle trailer while my cattle are there, right? Other things of that nature, or maybe even when they're not there, right? Like just something that it's those little things that I think kind of don't get written into, don't get discussed because people do them because they're convenient, they're necessary for them in their operation, but that landlords sometimes get frustrated with because they don't understand why that's being done. And then delay notification, and that might be on either side, right? Like if things especially if you're paying per day an animal unit there. You know, if you just the way things are going with your own operation, if you're going to be a week later, or even I would say even a few days late, I would notify the landlord sooner rather than later. Same goes for the landlord, or if if you're the farmer that's growing the crops, and harvest is going to be a little bit later because it was a wetter harvest than anticipated. Hopefully not. Um, what is the consequence of that? But then also, how am I going to notify you that that's what's going on, right? And hopefully sooner rather than later. I think people appreciate that, but sometimes that needs to be spelled out, so that people understand that there's not an additional penalty to kind of sitting, or there is an additional penalty to sitting on it. And then last but not least, then, you got to get the lawyers involved, right? Add the what if, right? Those liability provisions, right? The insurance, the termination. Well, sorry, the liability would be the insurance and the indemnification, these kind of things that kind of say, I'm going to be responsible for my own actions, but I'm not going to be responsible for anything else. Termination methods, right? Notification, right? If there's something that you don't like that somebody's doing, and then, right, so are you going to give them a right to cure? There is not one inherently within agricultural leases. The right to cure, like the right to resolve it, kind of happens in different areas of real estate. Not really a thing here, unless you put it in the lease. Dispute resolution, there are a variety of methods out there. I'll leave it at that. And then compliance requirements, right? I would say, both parties are required to abide by all laws and regulations upon the land. Obviously, agricultural law, land in Iowa is pretty cool in the sense that there's no county zoning. But outside of that, the laws still apply on the land. But that also is just, it's also important to remain eligible for USDA benefits in the future. And the last thing you want is, for a tenant to make that land ineligible for a period of time. So just state the obvious, right? But you want to put those things in there. And then you finish with the details. Just kidding. So choice of law, what state's laws are going to interpret this. Obviously, it's usually the location, right? But sometimes we are I'm in the north border county here in Iowa, right? And so we border Minnesota. And so it's not crazy unthinkable that people could put cattle, up in Minnesota for a while and then bring it back down to Iowa. And so in that point, then we'd have an issue of which state's laws control the contract. But in general, it's just always good to say, hey, this is an Iowa law contract. Or if you're in Nebraska, this is a Nebraska law contract, where, it's going to be interpreted according to the court cases of the state. And then also just make sure both people sign, right? In whatever representative capacity they might have. But that's kind of how that goes. And with that, I think I've left 5 minutes for questions and answers. If anybody happens to have any questions. I know that was a lot of information going at you very quickly, but hopefully it kind of, at least a few things stuck in your mind. And if you need the materials or anything, feel free to email me and I can send you a copy.